Hi, welcome to season 3 of the Digital Rights Africa podcast, where we discuss everything data protection and privacy, cybersecurity, child online protection, data governance, and intellectual property issues across Africa. I am your host, Teki Akuetteh, and today we will be joined by
Jenna Franklin, very thankful and grateful for being here today. I'm a data protection, privacy, cyber and AI partner at Stevenson Harwood, which is an international law firm but based in London.
Welcome, Jenna, and I'm very, very excited to have you. I don't think we have had anyone of your caliber in this seat. And so I'm very, very excited to have you here. And maybe so that we just kick this off right away, right? You're sitting on a digital rights podcast that looks mainly at the African continent, but you have worked mainly in the UK and across the EU and globally. What do you think of the African landscape, particularly around data protection and privacy?
So looking at it from a context of a UK EU perspective, primarily that's my practice base. I think Africa has so many opportunities, and it's fascinating to see how data protection, compliance, laws are evolving over time. You have 55 countries, which I think is so complex and not to be underestimated. The complexity of implementing, introducing legislation in each of those countries. So I think it's a challenge, but it's an opportunity, and I'm amazed at how there are only 22 countries that don't have privacy laws, and the kind of period of time, how quickly that has advanced.
Yes.
And I'd like to say it's because we have a global standard now that is GDPR. But I don't think GDPR can have the only credit for that. I think there's been an awful lot of work going on within each African country to drive human rights and particularly protecting personal information and the use of data.
Yes, and I completely agree with you. A lot of this have also been driven by, the fact that there's recognition across Africa by our governments that, look, we need to build some form of trust framework to develop, particularly when you're seeing technology as an important socioeconomic development factor. And so that has also been a significant driver. But also, of course, we have the relationships between African countries and the EU, particularly, which is also calling for better standards. So you have the donor agencies and the international communities that are also calling for that. But having said that, let me take you a bit back to what you said, which is the complexity of our environment, right? So when I look at it sometimes, I'm tempted to say, albeit controversially, maybe we shouldn't be going this route, right? It's a crazy thing to think about if you're looking at data protection in a community of 55 different countries, different legal systems, different governmental structures, and the fact that we don't even have that umbrella like the EU has within. We've been, fighting for decades and decades to get more of a centralized union within Africa. So what is this the way to go?
Probably because I'm quite optimistic about it. and I think when we look at member states within the EU, for example, they're so diverse, both legal systems and culturally, and yet they can come together in a unified approach under data protection laws just for one particular type of regime, of which there are many. So from intellectual property or from competition, consumer protection, just to give a few examples, even financial services regulations. My background, I've been in financial services for 15 years. So the interplay between data protection regulation and financial services regulation is probably one of my sweet spots and areas that I really enjoy the interplay between those two regulation pieces of different regimes. But I think it's coming back to your point, Teki, I think it's more around having a Pan-African approach that's a unified and centralized approach that you can then look to from a world stage standpoint. So you almost have the EU, the US, Africa, and when we talk about data transfer arrangements, for example, that you can be unified and have some kind of central body and an approach in that regard. So I think whilst there are complexities and challenges within each country, within each jurisdiction, I think it's important to also have some kind of centralised body that can be unified and has one voice.
That's an interesting angle to it, right? So, of course, we're not necessarily looking at a uniform law, so to speak. But I love this angle of, okay, we're targeting, we're dealing or addressing a particular problem, right? So what have you seen, because I know this is currently happening in the UK, right? I would want you to share a bit more of what is happening in the UK around this space, and maybe we can learn a thing or two.
Maybe we can all learn from each other. I think traditionally the European Union and GDPR implementation has had this approach of adequacy. I mean, it's quite a term to be deemed to be adequate. That's controversial in itself. And to say that you have equivalency of those data protection laws, I think for me in the UK context, we have to look at more detail around the political climate that we've endured over recent years. So particularly around leaving and Brexiting from the EU and no longer being a member state within the EU. So everything has changed. It's almost as if nothing has changed, but in fact everything has changed. So whilst we transposed the GDPR into UK law, GDPR still applies to us in our context from a UK perspective, but we've also had to look at our adequacy position and apply to the European Commission for validation on having the same adequate data protection laws. We've also developed our own adequacy framework so that we now...
To admit other countries in.
Exactly. Okay. So by way of example, the relationship, talking about building bridges and frameworks, we have now got the UK-US data bridge in place, for example, and we received adequacy from the EU, from the European Commission back in 2021. If I remember correctly, the exact date, I can't remember, but that was the shift and the change that we've had to now go through, is having our own adequacy assessment being carried out, meeting the criteria from a European Commission perspective, that then being approved back in 2021, and then introducing our own adequacy assessment, if you like, for countries to be able to transfer data out from the UK to other jurisdictions. And just to add to that, I think one of the key areas of recommendations and suggestions that I've seen that's been quite beneficial has been the implementation from a UK government perspective of the UK Expert Data Transfer Panel, for example.
Okay.
So this is made up of about 20 experts in data protection, and they range from...
In the UK?
Based in the UK.
Okay.
And they range from academia through to industry experts, and they all come together and opine on suitable approaches to data transfers on a cross-border basis.
Okay. And how does that work? Do they come up with guidelines? And
they come up with guidance, they come up with reports. They have a report which I'm very happy to share post-podcast. They've got specific recommendations and their rationale behind recommendations for areas like accountability, for trying to get political engagement and encourage that and incentivize.
That's quite interesting. I would really love to find out, how is this structured within the UK Data Protection Act then?
So it's a panel, a task force that's been set up by the UK government.
Okay. So it's outside of the Data
framework.
Protection Act, but then it's within the government, so it's not like it's a legal structure within the data protection.
Exactly.
But how do you then work And how is it that your guidelines and decisions, um, you know, what if you come up with something that is not what the data protection authority, for instance, is looking at around data transfers and the like?
So they work very closely between the UK government, the Information Commissioner's Office,
Okay.
and the panel experts will all work very closely together, take the recommendations into account. And we're also revising our UK data protection law at the moment. So that will also be taken into consideration going
In the
forward.
new
In the new data protection, it's currently and it's number 2, so it's been revised.
yes.
It's the second time, so that's going
Oh,
through
that's
an
interesting.
House of Lords at the
Yes,
moment. Yeah.
that is interesting. Now, on this, I really want to. I find this fascinating and interesting. This committee, and I'm seeing how particularly our continent can benefit from it, especially because it takes so long for the laws to be set up, and a lot of the time, even when we have these laws set up, the necessary expertise that is required, even from the regulator's perspective, to drive this agenda is almost non-existent. So I remember when I was setting up Ghana's Data Protection Commission, for instance, we had our board had then I wouldn't say toyed, but had then taken a decision around creation of subcommittees. But then our laws allow for the board to set up subcommittees, and so we were looking at more like some kind of working groups, that is made up of different people and background and skill sets that you normally will not necessarily be able to have access to filling in through there. So I'm finding that as extremely interesting. How has that been working, and where do you see the challenges, right?
That's really, you're picking up
Yeah.
so many points, Teki. I think for me, seeing having left the European Union and not being a seat at the table when it comes to from what was working party group discussions and then now evolved into the European Data Protection Board and no longer being a seat at that table. It's what can we do from a UK perspective to drive privacy.
I like that.
And I think perhaps one of the ways of doing so has been the adoption of these expert councils or task force initiatives. So even in the realms of AI regulation, for example, the government, so it's initiated by the UK government that they've set up a task force for specifically AI, for example. But there are other initiatives as well, and on a cross-regulatory basis.
Yeah.
So the Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum, the DRCF, has been established over the last couple of years, and that's made up of the UK Information Commissioner, who actually chairs it, John Edwards, and the Financial Conduct Authority, so financial services, the CMA, which is the Competition Markets Authority, and Ofcom as well.
Of course, yes,
and so
the
the four of
telco
them
regulator
work together, and they share
that's
information.
amazing. That is amazing, because I think that is also a space where we have been struggling, right? Which is what sometimes then calls people to just say that, look, we need to have maybe a regulator that handles AI, or a regulator which I don't think is going to work anyway, looking at how these technologies are developed and all of that. So in terms of, I want to pull us back a bit. I feel like there's so much that we should be talking about, and I'm hoping that the time will be sufficient. But I want to pull us back a bit to adequacy, and then this committee that has been set up to facilitate transfers. I have been for a very long time of the view that, adequacy for African countries, for most African countries, may only be a figment of our imagination. Looking at how long to date, like a lot of the African countries like Mauritius and Morocco, for a long time they've been sitting on this adequacy list, and nobody is really you know. And I'm pulling this back, especially because you're saying you don't have a seat at the table and all of that. Aside from having adequacy, how should we be really looking at these issues from the regulatory perspective, from private sector perspectives as well, because the data is going to move anyway,
So there
right?
are other opportunities. So from a GDPR perspective, we look to, and I call it the menu of data transfer
Yeah,
mechanisms, that
yeah,
if that's what I think you're talking
yes,
about. So adequacy being one, but it's not the only way to transfer data. So standard contractual clauses being another. And obviously there have been post-REMS 2
yeah.
decision making. There have been additional safeguards put in place there. So now organisations have to complete a transfer impact assessment or transfer risk assessment, for example, from a UK standpoint. So there are additional measures, safeguards that need to now be put in place for those onward data transfers on a cross-border basis outside of the UK or the EU. There are certification regimes, and we look to, for example, the EU-US data bridge and the
Yeah.
data privacy framework, and how that's now evolved from Safe Harbour
More
and
to, yeah,
Privacy
privacy shield
Shield, and now we
yeah.
have the data privacy framework. So there are other mechanisms that can be, and that can be used as a framework, as a structure for building out your own data transfer
Yeah.
framework from an African perspective.
Yeah, because it's quite challenging, 55 countries, and the data is actually moving around quite a bit within different African countries. So it's really quite important that we start thinking around, how to make some of these things work without necessarily waiting for that uniform law that we dream about, that ideal situation where all African countries are one, and all of that. But let me pull you back a bit to what we were talking about earlier around the importance of ensuring that all parties cooperate in this space, particularly around data protection. And if we're looking at even the new technologies, right? The emerging technologies, AI, for instance. If you have AI that is affecting health, AI that is affecting the financial sector, AI, we can't have like a centralized AI regulator. And even if we want to have that within the African context, that will take a long time, and probably the technology would have been obsolete by the time we're able to come up with the right framework for it. So how should we be thinking around this? Is this some area, is there something that you want to share around what you are doing or looking at in the UK?
So from the UK's perspective, I think the principles-based approach, there was a white paper issued earlier this year that talked about having specific
From the
principles
ICO?
from the this is from the government, so from the
Okay.
UK government initiated. And that's quite similar to what we're seeing with the US as well, for example, with the executive order that was announced last month. And also in Japan as well. So there are jurisdictions, and certainly from an OECD standpoint, with the Hiroshima AI principle process, I think they are methods, certainly criteria that can be worked within your own organisation to adhere to the development and deployment and use of AI within your organisation. I think there's kind of the hard approach, which is the EU AI Act, for example, where it's very prescriptive and has only just been finalised and doesn't come into effect until 2026. So I think certainly from my perspective, the approach should be more around principles based and have that flexibility
to
absolutely, rather
learn
than
and make mistakes and grow.
Because in 2 years' time, I mean, look how quickly it's evolved in the last 12 months. By 2 years from now. And I also think that regulations should be technology agnostic.
I agree.
To a large extent. So otherwise it's going to be redundant.
Oh wow! All too soon. We've come to the end, but I just want to give you the opportunity to give us some final remarks, maybe some word of advice for our listeners, for our governments, for our regulators on what we should be thinking about, because it's a very complex. I think if there's anything about this conversation we've tried to have in 20 minutes, is that this is a very complex process. So how should we move around this maze?
I think having a central body to talk about these issues is really important, but maybe task forces on specific topics. So, like data transfers, like AI, and setting those bodies up, and they have representation from each of the countries. I think it's good to look forward into the future and what you actually want to achieve, and then work back. So you're setting a plan of how you want to go about achieving those goals, and remaining optimistic in the process.
All right. Thank you. You heard it all from Jenna. Thank you once again for joining us. All too soon, we've come to the end. But as always, I want to invite you to subscribe to our channel and continue to listen to subsequent episodes that will come on. Thank you and have a wonderful day.